And I began to ask myself, everybody else had their gods, what are ours? What is the shape of our society in the form of myth and legend? Who are our gods? Who are our evil gods? And who are our good ones? And I tried to resolve them in the new gods. And I came up with some very, very interesting characters and very good sales, which satisfied me immensely. Now, I didn't resolve the questions. I'm a guy who lives with a lot of questions. I say, what's out there? And I try to resolve that. And I never can. I don't think anybody can.
All right, so I'm Jason Horn. This is my channel, Longboxer, and I'm going to be talking today for the first time to someone else. This is my friend, Tim Callahan.
Hello, Jason Horn and America and everybody else.
So we're friends from a while back. We met at comic conventions through other friends. So we've known each other probably like 10 years.
Yeah, at least. I think maybe even more. I was going to Comic-Cons like 2006, so probably like 14, 15 years almost.
That's crazy. So so normally when I'm talking about comics, I'm just a dipstick who has some opinions, but this guy, Tim Callahan, ladies and gentlemen, is a man who has been paid and published to talk about comics. This is like a real deal. He's not just like some schmo that I picked up off the street to talk about comics. He is the real deal. So tell everybody like some of the stuff that you've written and talked about.
Oh yeah, I started off, I worked for CBR when CBR was readable back in the old days when Jonah Weiland ran it.
Yeah.
And so I used to have a column on CBR called When Words Collide, and I wrote a book about Grant Morrison in the early years. I edited and put together Teenagers from the Future about the Legion of Superheroes. And then I worked for a whole bunch of different sites, and I've been published in Back Issue Magazine. If you ever pick up the Godland Celestial editions, my essays and pieces are in volumes 2 and 3 of that from Image Comics. I've got a bunch of stuff out there, but I've actually stepped away from writing about comics for a few years because I've been writing some role-playing game stuff that's been published, and I'm also getting my doctorate. So I've been tied up with the doctoral work.
Yeah, that's a pretty consuming slate you've got there. So yeah, probably no time for. So this is a treat. So not only, are you a bona fide, comic commentator, but this is like a rare treat to get you talking about comics at all these days.
Right, exclusive. Pull me out of retirement.
That's right. You keep trying to get away, but I'll pull you back in. And the thing that's going to pull you back in is New Gods. That's what we're going to be talking about. Kirby leaves Marvel and like an atomic bomb going off, starts an entire universe at DC. What was your thoughts a little bit before New Gods? Like, what are just your general thoughts when you were a kid about Kirby? Because a lot of people like me looked at Kirby as like this old guy. Like, that's the old stuff. That's not my stuff. That's not my comics. And so I was really cold to Kirby. Was that your experience as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess my first real exposure to Kirby would have been maybe on the covers of the Invaders comics I was picking up. And I think I was picking up the Invaders even in back issues because it was cheap. And so when I didn't find out about comic book shops until I was, I guess, like 12 or 13. So when I was a kid, I would just get, general store comics.
Yeah.
And I didn't buy a bunch of them until maybe I was probably 11 or 12 when I started getting into comics at all. And then all of a sudden I found out comic shops existed. And I remember seeing old issues of the Invaders, which wouldn't have been that old at the time. They were probably only a couple of years before that. And I definitely remember seeing the Superpowers comic when it came out and thinking how goofy those covers looked. And I wanted nothing to do with anything to do with Kirby covers at that time. But I also didn't like Bill Sienkiewicz. I was seeing Superpowers and Elektra Assassin, and I was like, those guys can't draw. They're terrible. So I quickly advanced to appreciating Bill Sienkiewicz. And then my love for Kirby definitely came later, and I fell in love with his 70s stuff way before I fell in love with his Marvel work. I liked his weird 70s stuff that I was seeing in the back issue bins. And I remember when New Gods was printed in the Baxter editions, the 6-issue limited series, I must have picked that up shortly after it came out because I couldn't have been that old. I was in early high school, maybe 9th or 10th grade, but I still didn't know what to make of it. It was weird. I liked it. It was different, but I didn't necessarily understand it. I didn't really appreciate the artistry. I just thought it was weird and Darkseid. By then, it had been on the Superpowers TV show, so I was aware of the characters from that cartoon verse. How about you?
Yeah, I think the seeing them on the Superpowers cartoon was definitely my exposure to the New Gods. But yeah, like seeing Kirby stuff. When I thought of Kirby as a kid, I just thought of like Captain America punching Hitler, and that's not what Kirby looked like. Like if you read the New Gods, like this stuff is totally different than that. But that's what I kept. That's what I always thought. Like his art was. His art was that old '40s stuff that that stuff my grandpa would have read. That's not for me. I'm all about Liefeld and McFarlane and Jim Lee, so that stuff's not for me. But eventually, I'm not sure what happened. Like when it started to click with me. I'm not exact. I think it was probably like I used to work at a place where there was a comic friend there, and he finally like convinced me to read some stuff. And I think it was more. I don't think it was the DC stuff yet, but it was the later stuff, like when his stuff on Thor and stuff actually looked like what the New Gods kind of stuff looks like, where it wasn't just like that old wartime comics. So I kind of was giving him a chance then. But then when I started reading like Celestials, I know is when I went nuts. That's when I started buying everything. Once I read that, I went back and got all the New God stuff. So I got those Baxter reprints as well. Like those, I tracked those down out of like cheap bins, and that was my first time to actually read the New Gods. And one of the things we're going to do here is talk about the different formats that we have the New Gods in, because we have those Baxter reprints. And if you don't know what those are, like I'm going to actually like start recording here as well, some visuals that I can actually go as we're talking. I'll cycle through where you can actually see what we're talking about.
Nice.
So, so these Baxter reprints, they're called Baxter because that's the type of paper it was printed on. It was like nicer paper than newsprint, essentially. And so they in 83 or 84 is when DC went back to Kirby and said, hey, let's reproduce, these old issues, and then we're going to end these reproductions with some new pages, and then you're going to do your Hunger Dogs, which will like, tie it all up, which isn't exactly the way it went down, but that was their plan. And so we have that. So I have the Baxter reprints, and then also these the Kirby trades. So this here. These trades that they put out in like the mid 2000s.
The Omnibus editions, right? They're called Omnibus, but they're not the big, thick, giant Omnibuy.
Yeah, I love these. These are so good. Like these are printed on like newsprint paper, and with flat, good reproduced coloring. It's different coloring. I went in and looked to see like how close this coloring was to the Baxter recoloring, and it's really close. But it is different coloring. Like whatever files they had, they didn't use the same files, because I went in and like literally analyzed like each little cut. So the Omnibus coloring is different, and the Baxter coloring is different. And then there's the original issues, which I only have like a few of those. I have more Forever People. I only have like one issue of the New Gods. But I also have, me and you also have the giant artist edition.
Yeah.
So this is like you can't even get it into frame. It's nuts. What are your thoughts on these artists? I love these artist editions, but they're definitely not really. They're expensive and they're gigantic and hard to store. But this is the only one I own. What about you?
I own all but about 20 of them. So I own approximately 100 artist editions. Believe it or not,
That's
I own almost all. It's my preferred format. As I get older, no joke, I can see the appeal of large print books and comics, and I'm like, hey, this is a way to have something that's really pleasurable to read. I can read all the lettering, no problem, and I just love the original art. I love that size. So artist editions are my preferred format, and then on top of that, if it's not an artist edition, I like oversized trades. I don't like those big, thick omnibus editions that Marvel puts out, or DC, the ones that you have to like crack the spine and put it on a big desk to hold up because it's 1,000 pages. So I don't like the thick books, but I like the big, oversized, 11 by 17 or whatever those are. Those are massive. I love those. So I have almost all of them. And the Kirby stuff, I'm in the same boat as you. I only own one original edition of the New Gods. It's the one with Bug in it. So I think it's issue 8 or something like that.
Yeah.
That's the only one I ever was able to track down. So my more obsessive phase with Kirby definitely didn't happen until the 2000s, I would say. I picked up the Baxter reprints, the New Gods, in the 80s, probably the mid 80s. So probably maybe 2 or 3 years after they came out. And then when I was starting to go to conventions again in the early 2000s, and I was hitting 50-cent and dollar bins, I would just buy any 70s Kirby I came across. So whatever it was. And there wasn't much New Gods in the dollar bins even back then.
Yeah.
So I was able to get a full run of Commandy. I was able to get the 2001 stuff. I was able to get Machine Man and Devil Dinosaur and all those things really cheap. But I was obsessed with how they looked. So I was fascinated with it. And I started picking up the Kirby Collector around that time as well. So that sort of all came together for me. And I really, at this point, I just appreciate Kirby on such a different level. Like, I feel like I can soak it in a way that when I look at other comics from that same era, I do not have the same feeling about. Kirby to me is just so special.
It's interesting that you mentioned the 2001. That's what clicked with me. Even before the Celestials, I read that Treasury edition, and that was like super eye-opening. That comic, I don't know if anyone I don't know how popular of a comic that is. I think it is amongst creators and amongst big fans, but like, track that down, everybody. It's amazing. I'll show some B-roll of it here later. It was a big influence. I saw Bruce Timm talk about it. It was a big influence on the Superman animated series. Like, a lot of the tech, a lot of when they were trying to figure out what the Superman the animated series should look like, they went to 2001.
Yeah.
Not the New God stuff, but specifically 2001.
Amazing.
And it's super cool. It's that I like that movie growing up. I mean, it's okay. It's good. I like it. But that comic opened my eyes. Like, oh, that's what the movie is.
Yeah.
Like, I actually understood the movie better reading Kirby's comic.
And Kirby's comic is not really an adaptation of the movie. It was supposed to be. It's his own thing. It's a Kirby comic. And those Treasure editions, too. That's another. Anything Treasure edition size, I scoop up. That's a great form factor for me. I love it.
Nice. So one of the things that's interesting that some of the things I've been thinking about as far as the New Gods goes, like, so Kirby works at Marvel for all these years, and he feels like he's not getting the recognition, he's not getting the pay that he wants and deserves, and so DC comes to him. Like, DC made the offer. I've done a bit of research, and I'll probably get some stuff wrong, and that's fine. But from the research I did, it sounded like DC came to him, not knowing, assuming he was probably unhappy or whatever, but like just trying to get him. And they made an offer. They were like, please come to DC, and we'll let you do whatever you want, essentially, which was highly not normal in comics. Like, one of the things that I didn't really realize that I thought was interesting was that, so at this point, Kirby had moved to California, and they were going to let him like create this entire line of comics and not even be in New York, not even be in the New York offices, just let him create it in California, and barely, they would take over some editorial stuff, especially, changing the Superman's face and stuff like that. But they kind of just let him do whatever, which is kind of crazy. I'd never heard of, anyone else having that kind of deal in comics, especially back then.
Yeah, he was definitely pioneering because he was working out in LA. He was already doing some of the animation stuff. But that's why those first couple of issues of the New Gods are inked by Vinnie Colletta.
Yeah.
They wouldn't let him have his own inker out on the West Coast, so he had to send the pencil pages in. Vince Colletta would ink them in New York City, and then they would be published. But then the later issues are inked by Mike Royer. So they were produced entirely out in California, and he sent in the completed packages of the last third of the last 2/3 of the series of the New Gods.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was a special opportunity, and it was awesome. I mean, what a way to tap into Kirby's creative genius is just to let him go wild. And you see in the New Gods, you see what happens when he's allowed to do that, and also like where he goes astray. Because New Gods, as we'll talk about, it doesn't. We're going to talk about the first 2 issues today, but it goes like in a different direction by issue 3, and it's not completely a narrative thread all the way through, but it's still wonderful and full of imaginative ideas.
Yep, totally. It's the thing I kept thinking about. It's this intersection of like superheroes, religion, and technology that, like, in a way that I can't even fathom how it was taken at the time. Like, I read it now, when I read it probably like 15 years ago, I probably looked at it differently than I looked at it now. But how in the world did people look at this in 1968, 69, and 70, or when around that time? It's such a, this is like, the Vietnam era. This is like technology at the time was like, color TV was pretty big at this point finally, but like, email and the internet existed, but like none of that stuff, it was just early stage. All that stuff was technology as we think of it now was at its infancy when these comics came out. But there's a lot of like, technology and divinity mixed together in these comics.
Yeah, it's way more ambitious than what you would see on the comic book stands. I mean, if you go to one of those websites and you look at what else was on the comic stands in 1971, it was like the beginnings of the Barry Windsor Smith Conan. So Roy Thomas, Barry Windsor Smith Conan the Barbarian. That was probably one of the more famous things that was coming out now, retrospect, looking back on it. And then there was some of that Neil Adams Batman were still coming out, but most of it was drawn by Irv Novick at the time. So there were these generic superhero comics and then a ton of like kids comics. Not much in the way of Marvel and DC as far as anything creative. And then you've got all these Jack Kirby stories, New Gods, Forever People, Mr. Miracle, the Jimmy Olsen stuff, like back to back to back. And it was unlike anything else on the stands at the time.
And it was ambitious, not even just in the scope of the story, like having like launching a line of comics that are all connected, which had never really happened. Like, Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, all that stuff was kind of like put together. And same with DC, like those books were launched separately and then kind of brought together. But this is like launching an entire universe of connected books from inception, which had never been done. But also like his goal was, from what, like reading the introductions and the afterwards and these omnibus, is like his intention was for these to be collected, like all these interconnected stories to be collected at the time, which that's another thing. Like that just didn't really happen. Like DC was like their early kind of like collecting books were like these blue ribbon digests from like, and that was like 81. Like, so this is still like over a decade before like stuff is really getting collected. So even him thinking that is crazy. Like even that was ambitious.
Yeah, and it's basically almost a decade before the direct market as we know it. So the idea of even being able to go in and find a certain comic, it's a crapshoot. You go to the grocery store, you go to the local corner store, you go to the spinner rack and hope you can find something. And he was using that delivery mechanism to create an entire world that had multiple parts every month or two. Yeah, it was completely ambitious. It would be ambitious today. It would be off the charts ambitious for a single writer-artist to launch something that has multiple books in it, intertwined. And Jonathan Hickman's doing it right now with X-Men, and he's only writing 1.5 of the books. And it still seems ambitious. And Kirby was writing and drawing 4 of them.
Yeah, imagine doing that with no direct market. It's unbelievable. Like the best you could do to find old comics was like maybe an antique store, like back in the day. Before direct market, maybe an antique store would maybe have some comics. That's unfathomable in our mind. So today is, as we're filming this, today is Easter, which is, pretty on point for this because, the death of God and the resurrection. So that's what this story is.
Yeah.
So New Gods #1 starts with the death of old gods, whatever that is. And in my mind, I'm wondering how much of this was like Kirby saying all that work I did at Marvel, not just God. And a lot of people compare it to Thor and Ragnarok and that kind of stuff. And that makes sense. But I'm wondering how much of this was just literally all of my work creating the gods of the Marvel universe. Imagine all that just died. And this is what springs forth from the remnants of that death.
Yeah, the opening word is epilogue. And it's a splash page of all these things dead, all these dead beings. I mean, you can see a guy with a winged helmet and a hammer right in the center. So I think that's why people jump to the Thor comparison. And there is Balder is referenced, although it's spelled differently in the New Gods. So you can make a connection to the Asgardians. But yeah, I think you're right. I think it's just the leftover remnants of what he's leaving behind at Marvel. He's kind of leaving it in ruins and moving up. He's starting with this epilogue. The other thing I'd like to point out about New Gods, this is the first time, other than maybe in the 80s when I first picked up these Baxter issues, that I've ever read New Gods separate from the rest of the Fourth World. And so the Fourth World Omnibus, the Kirby Fourth World Omnibus, collects it in publication and in sequential order the way I guess it was supposed to be read. And so it's interspersing. It starts with Jimmy Olsen and then it weaves in the Forever People and New Gods and Mr. Miracle. Reading New Gods by itself, though, there's no connection with the DC universe at all. All of those connective tissues to the DC universe are entirely in the other series. Mr. Miracle has some, Jimmy Olsen has a ton. New Gods is completely separate from any DC Universe continuity, even though it's part of that fourth world. And the other thing he does with New Gods that he doesn't do, because I looked back into that omnibus, he uses the 6-panel grid a lot. So the 6-panel grid's his go-to format for laying out a page. Every other issue in that fourth world omnibus volume 1 has a splash page and then starts right into the 6-panel grid. New Gods doesn't go into the 6-panel grid for like 6 pages. It starts with splash page, big panels, 3 panels, big panel. It doesn't even ease into the 6-panel grid the way the other ones do. So he is setting up the New Gods as something really distinct and really epic that is part of the fourth world, but is also somehow lifted above.
Yeah, it's so the issue 1 is essentially it's a lot of splash page setup at first, showing off this, you know, the old gods are dead, and from those ashes, these 2 planets form. There's New Genesis, which is this paradise filled with, you know, these flying happy gods. It's this beautiful place with like, it's essentially like the hippie commune of its day. Yep. So filled with literally, and like the Forever People, it literally is that. It's these young hippies that their power together can save the universe, which is it kind of dates it, but it's also just like charming and awesome at the same time.
Yeah, it's kind of like heaven and Eden all mixed into one. It's just this pure, uncontaminated place. It does have super technology though, so it's not primitive. It's ultra high tech. They have this floating city where they live, but then there's also this beautiful green planet in which the city orbits, and that's New Genesis. But then you have the opposite of that, which is Apocalypse, which is just the most dire hellhole, ruled by Darkseid, completely tyrannical.
Yeah, the thing that's interesting about about setting up this universe of this 2 opposing forces of just literal good and evil, it makes it simple, but it also there's so many characters introduced, like just thrown at you throughout the entire run of New Gods and all of his interconnected worlds. So many characters. It's a simple concept, simple setup, but it gets complicated because there's so much going on, especially like more so in the other ones than New Gods. New Gods is essentially this battle of Orion versus Darkseid. So there had been this peace between these 2 worlds, and at first you don't really understand what set up that peace, but they get to that eventually. But and the thing I didn't remember reading this now was that Orion didn't know, he didn't know. Yeah. He didn't know that he's Darkseid's son. So spoilers on that if you somehow don't know that. But but that's the thing. I was like, oh man, he didn't even know. That's crazy. And so so he has this internal conflict. Like he knows that he doesn't belong, and that's the other thing that I think I was trying to, you know, suss out, like how much of this is Kirby's mind. Like he felt like, you know, he was at Marvel making these comics and he didn't belong. Like it was his world. Like he created that universe essentially, like co-created whatever with Stan Lee, but he felt like he didn't belong. And I'm wondering how much of that was put into Orion.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting perspective. Orion has other Kirby traits too. Like Kirby supposedly had a temper, and he was, although a complete idea person and was filled with creativity, he was known for his physicality, the fact that he would just sit down and draw. It's almost like he had this imbued muscle memory on how to draw comics and how to be a genius with his physical body in the act of drawing. And so Orion represents this physicality and this sort of primal anger, but also he's got the nobility of a warrior. But he's not only that, he's got that dual persona too. So he doesn't know he's the son of Darkseid, or he doesn't make explicit if he does know, but he's got a beautiful, handsome appearance that is an illusion. And actually it's the mother box, the technology of the New Gods, creates this handsome appearance that he uses. He covers it with a helmet anyway, but he's got these good looks. And then when he reveals his true self, he's got this Cro-Magnon-like form with these bushy eyebrows that they don't quite ink right in the first issue. So in the first issue, he doesn't look all that different in his Cro-Magnon form and his regular form, which when I was a kid reading it, I was like, I don't know what he's supposed to be doing here. He's supposed to be transforming, but looks like the same guy. But in later issues, you really see those features magnified. And so he's got that duality of himself too. And, you know, I don't know, it's hard for me to get into biographical criticism because you just don't know what motivated people to do things. But he does seem like a Kirby archetype. He seems like that physicality that Kirby has.
Yeah, it's something I thought about a lot. It reminded me when I was trying to, like, think of all these things, like, I wonder if his intention was this. It reminded me of being in high school and like learning about Shakespeare. And I remember at the time, because they would be presenting Shakespeare and like, well, that he intended this and this meant this. And at the time I was like, did he really intend all this, or is this just the mythology and the educational system that's built all this up? And that's the way I kind of felt when I was thinking about all this. And I tell my daughter now, because my daughter's like 8, and sometimes she'll have questions about things, and I'll try to explain. The other day I literally explained what art was to her.
Nice.
So I was just trying to explain in the simplest of terms, like, art is something that someone created to either get you to think or to feel something that you otherwise wouldn't have, to get you to understand something or feel something. And so I was trying to, like, forget all of the the things I was trying to figure out, like, oh, does the fashion, like the anti-life equation that Darkseid is searching for, is this like fascist idea, and that's what Kirby defeated in World War II. I was trying to stop thinking about all that stuff and just really try to focus on not his intentions, but just like, what does this do for you? What does this make you think? What does this make you feel? And so that's what I was trying. And the other thing I try to tell her is what their intentions are in creating art or whatever it is, like whatever they're trying to get you to feel or think, that's actually not as important as what you do with it. Like, what you do with what you feel or think of the art is actually more important. And so thinking of the New Gods in that term is amazing, because what this did was inspire an entire generation of comics creators.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, in criticism, we talk about the intentional fallacy, which is the idea that you can't know an author's intent. And even if you do, even if they tell you, they might be mistaken, because what they intended to do may not actually come across in the final product. So it doesn't matter what's intended, exactly what you're saying. What matters is the effect, the impact. And the impact of this on the reader is certainly, it's profound in my case. It's profound in your case, but it's profound for an entire generation of creators who then took these ideas and then were inspired by them, either to try to use them and to try to make sense out of it, because part of what is so charming about New Gods is that he throws out these ideas that are archetypal and that have potency, but he doesn't resolve a lot of the things he throws out. He puts them out there, and then he's introducing new characters left and right, every issue. And I think Mark Evanier talks about that in one of the afterwards, and certainly in interviews, where when he was an assistant to Kirby, him and Steve Sherman were trying to tell Jack, like, don't introduce the Black Racer who comes in later, because you still have to deal with this Orion and Light Ray stuff that's in the early 2 issues. He was just throwing things against the wall, and he could not help it. He could not help but create these things. So he inspired a lot of people to take it and run with it, and he certainly inspired a lot of people to just create entire universes. And I think he had based on what I've read, he had a major impact on a lot of the directors in Hollywood too. So a lot of the people who we think of as auteurs who created anything that has a spectacle, they were hooked into that Jack Kirby line big time.
That's all. Yeah, and the speed at which he was throwing things out there is also along the lines of, he was doing he was contract, not just doing because he was wanting to do it. He was contracted to do 15 pages a week.
Right.
That's unbelievable. Like, even because you always hear this about Kirby, like, he's fast. He's just penciling and it's just going, and he works all day, and he does so many pages a day. You hear that and you know that, but still, when you actually sit and think about 15 pages a week, it's so remarkable. Even if he's just penciling and writing, but even like, this is the first time he's writing, so that's another thing that's like super important.
Yeah.
Like, all that other stuff, he was making a lot of story choices, obviously, at Marvel and stuff, and then Stan would come in and like add dialogue or whatever, or Stan would have the original idea, like, hey, fight Dr. Doom. And then, so Kirby was doing a form of writing, but this is the first, like, unfiltered, all Kirby, other than the inking and some, like you said, early editorial choices being made in New York, but especially these later issues when it's all him, not inking, but like, it's inking that's at least under his, purview. So it is just like unfiltered Kirby for the first time ever. That had not happened yet.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe you found a source that says something about Kirby's writing process, but my understanding of Kirby's writing process is he was writing by drawing the story. Yeah. And there's no notebooks filled with ideas that he then converts into New Gods scripts that he then draws. Like, that's not how it works. Everything was just drawn on the page. He put the dialogue in as he was drawing, and that is his method of writing. There are no ancillary writing materials that have ever been uncovered from what I've seen. So that is amazing, because he's got the whole thing in his head. He's walking this tightrope, these 4 simultaneous tightropes. He doesn't really contradict himself. So even though not everything pays off and it goes in different directions, it still has a narrative through line that takes some twists and turns, but he's always getting back to the big ideas that he established, and he doesn't have characters who act completely different from one page to the next, even though he's literally just making it up as he goes along.
Yeah, it's crazy to have all that, and some of the stuff that Evan and I are. How do you pronounce it, Mark? What's his name?
I think it's Evanier.
Evanier. Okay. So a lot of the stuff that Evanier was saying was like you said, like it was just coming out of him onto the page, to the point where, like, like I don't think they knew what was going on. Like they couldn't follow the story. It was just pouring out of him so quickly. That's pretty astounding. So they were like some young guys, like Steve Sherman and Mark were like these young guys, like living in California, who just like were comic fans, and he's like, hey, I need some assistance. And essentially they were just like putting the letter columns together in the back of these Fourth World books.
Yeah, they were just like editorial assistants doing chores and running errands for the Kirby family.
That's so crazy. I saw like some interviews where Roz was talking about, like, they were just, when they lived in California, like kids would just come by, like kids would know where he lived and stop by, and she would make them sandwiches, and they would just go down to the basement, and Kirby would be drawing, and they would just hang out and talk about comics. Can you fathom that for a second?
I can't even imagine. I can't imagine being Kirby in that situation or being one of those kids. And the fact that he was still so productive with those kind of distractions in his life.
I can't. Like, my kids will, like, make some mess, and I got to stop drawing and deal with it. Like, and I can't, it'll take me 2 hours to get back to where I was drawing.
Yeah. Well, especially when you're doing something creative. I mean, I mentioned I'm working on my dissertation. Even that, which isn't super creative, a lot of it is just grunt work, putting in the hours. Like, I've got to have some set aside time. I can't just do 30 minutes here. I can't be distracted. And so when I've ever done anything creative, I need to have that peace and quiet. I need to have that uninterrupted time to get into the rhythm of the story that I'm telling. Or I've done a little bit of drawing as well, not to the extent that you have, certainly not to the extent Kirby has. Nobody's lived up to that. But I can't imagine just interrupting your flow. But I guess if you just live and breathe it, like Kirby, by that time, Kirby was living and breathing, drawing comics. It was just automatic to him almost. But yet it wasn't automatic, because even though he's got some themes that overlap, none of the Fourth World books are the same. All 4 of them are distinct. Nothing that he did in Fourth World does he do exactly the same way again. In the Eternals, he brings back some of these ideas of gods. In Captain Victory, I don't know if we're going to talk about Captain Victory, but did you know that Captain Victory from Pacific is actually a sequel to the New Gods? I don't know if you knew that.
I did not know that. I do have some of those issues. I don't know how many I have. But
it's an unofficial sequel, because Captain Victory alludes to the fact that he's actually Orion's son in the later issues. Yes.
I'll have to reread that now with the new eyes. That's interesting.
So the story continues, but he's so creative and so inventive. Just to get back to the actual pages of the first issue, one of the things that I did think was interesting, I talked about how Kirby didn't really contradict himself and keep going, but he did lay some groundwork for things that he didn't pursue. And right away, the first time we meet Metron, and Metron's this being who has this almost omniscience, the super scientist, basically, floats around in his Mobius chair. Highfather, who's essentially the ruler of New Genesis, he's super skeptical of Metron. And Metron is almost presented as this duplicitous character who's not to be trusted. Which
my notes on Metron, what I wrote down was Metron is an omnipotent knowledge jerk.
But we never have a reason not to trust him throughout the whole series. But for some reason, the first time he's introduced, it's like, oh, we got to watch this guy. But I wonder if that has to do with the dynamic Kirby setting up. And I'm almost thinking of it in the terms of archetypes. And so Orion represents the body and the physicality. And Metron represents the brain. He's pure intellect, pure knowledge. And then Highfather represents like the spirit or the soul. And so New Genesis is about spirit and soul and not about intellect, even though it's a high-tech civilization. And so that's why Metron is suspicious. Is it pure intellect without a heart is the thing that you have to worry about. And I think that's what the series is getting at ultimately. But I don't know that Kirby really explores it other than by setting up that triumvirate of characters in the opening scene.
It's so crazy to have that rich of an analysis on just like a setup. Like,
yeah.
You could do an entire series just on like the first few pages of New Gods. It's so imaginative and there's so much depth to it in just the premise. Like the premise has depth.
And even, I mean, I don't know if you're going to be able to show highlights, but there's a thing on page 8 of the first issue where there's a panel, and it shows Highfather in the middle and Orion on one side and Metron on the other. And visually, Kirby's setting up that triumvirate. Visually, Kirby is like, here's the dichotomy, here's the contrast that I am establishing. And then they, at that point, introduce this concept of the source, which is this powerful. The source, I think, is pretty funny, actually, even though it's supposed to be this serious, profound, like godlike script that appears, because the whole setup of the New Gods is the anti-life equation that Darkseid is seeking. And the anti-life equation, which is never found, really, but Darkseid's always looking for the anti-life equation. And the anti-life equation is not death. The anti-life equation is a loss of choice. So not having any choice. So it's the loss of free will. The loss of free will is the anti-life according to the way New Gods is set up. But yet the source will tell you what you should do. And then Orion does exactly what the source tells him. Like word for word, he does point by point what the source tells him to do. So what does that mean? How do you interpret that?
Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, the source is this like flaming hand connection to God, whatever that means, whatever the God is to New Gods.
Yeah,
that's what this source is. Something that created everything, even these immensely powerful beings. And yeah, you're right. That's something I didn't really think about. That they just literally listen to this godlike God character.
Yeah, and they comment on it though. They're like, well, at least we're doing it by choice. But they're still following the decree of this prophecy that the source is writing on the flaming wall, or flaming hand writes on the wall. And so is that any different than the anti-life? And in Kirby's depiction of it is different, but it's still like, how different is it really? If you're just going along with what fate tells you to do, is that exactly the same as having no free will? Kirby likes those ideas. I don't know that he fully explores them, because ultimately he's got to get into the punching, which is a really important part of any Jack Kirby comic.
Yep. And so this first issue, Orion goes to Apocalypse and discovers that, spoiler, he's not there, because as you see in the other series, he's on Earth looking for this anti-life equation. And so that starts setting up this stuff in issue 2 where Orion like rescues these humans. So like Darkseid had taken these humans and was experimenting on them, I guess, and to try to like figure out, because Darkseid is under the impression that the anti-life equation is inside the mind of someone on Earth. So he's experimenting on these humans to try to figure out, like, how do I get inside these people's minds? Like, so that's why he has these people. And these people become like these supporting characters for Orion for a while. He becomes like their human gang member. Like they team up together and start like solving mysteries. It's crazy. It's like they're his Scooby gang.
Yeah, it becomes this like crime drama where he assumes this civilian identity to hang out with these humans. By the way, the humans are great because every time they appear, they introduce themselves by using their first names and last names. So you can't be, even though they look totally different. There's an old guy, there's a young, handsome guy, and there's a young woman. Every time they introduce themselves, they're like, here's who I am. And that's like a relic of the 1970s when you had to introduce yourself, because who knows? But think of how preposterous that is. This story only makes any kind of sense if you read other parts of the Fourth World. So it doesn't really fit that mold where, oh, you could pick up any comic and figure out what's going on. Not really with the Fourth World. Like everything, you can experience it. It's like poetry, right? You can feel it. You can have a reaction to it. But it's not really something that makes any sense by itself. Yet these characters have to introduce themselves fully in every single issue.
That's right. So when I was reading it, you were saying that like the artist edition is your preferred method, which still boggles my mind. But I think out of reading the different 3 formats, I think the Baxter reprints was my favorite. I think this paper soaks up the colors and the inks perfectly. It's really good. I thought I'm the kind of guy who likes, especially with Kirby, I like beat up reader copies because I like having the experience of what it would have been at the time. But I think, I mean, you know, I can't really afford all the new Gods issues. So barring having those originals, I think out of the 3 formats we were reading, these Baxter reprints are really good.
No, I agree. As far as reader copies, even though the artist edition are my preferred format as far as like collecting and owning and having, these Baxter editions are the ones to get if you just want to read on the couch or, you know, before bed. These are the ones that are like, they look great. And the paper, Baxter paper is that higher end paper from the 80s, but it's not glossy. It's still a matte paper, and it has a toothiness to it, and it definitely soaks in the colors. And so I didn't compare the issue of New Gods that I do have to the Baxter. How different is the recoloring? Did you look at that? The Baxter recoloring compared to the original New Gods?
The original, I did that with the Forever People issue, and they really closely like tried to stick to the color choices. There were a few things like Desaad's robe was colored blue, like in the original issue, and so they made that purple to kind of go with his character eventually. But yeah, other than like things like that, it's pretty faithful. Like there are some choices here and there where it's like, okay, this guy made a decision clearly, whoever was who was recoloring these the Baxter reprints, but it's pretty faithful. It's faithful and it looks great. And they're cheap. Like you can find these in the 50-cent bin, and I have a story about that. So this is preposterous. I think I might have told this story before, but so as I was tracking these down originally, like probably like 15, 20 years ago, before I was even making comics, all I needed was the last issue. I needed the first issue of these Baxter reprints. It was the last one that I needed to have them all. And I found it in a 50-cent bin. And I noticed, as I was looking at it, I noticed it was signed on the cover by Jack Kirby.
Amazing.
And I was like, I don't know if this is real, but this dude is not going to let me have this comic if he notices it. So I like bought a few other issues that I probably didn't even want just to have it in the middle. And the dude looked at all of them and was like, oh, I've been looking for this for years. I can't sell you this. And I was like, now, I would have not let that happen. I would have just like probably done something shady to own that comic. But me being a nice young kid 15, 20 years ago, like I was really like, I understand, but man, that stinks. I really wish that would have been amazing to have.
Yeah.
But that's what I think of when I think of these. I remember like it was yesterday.
Oh, that trauma of like, I'm going to get this thing. Oh, disappointed. Snatched from the jaws of victory.
Yeah, and that dude had like hundreds of long boxes. I don't even remember what show I was at, but I was at a big show, and that guy just had hundreds of long boxes. So I can see why he'd never tracked it down, but I was just like heartbroken that I didn't get it. But I eventually found all these Baxter reprints, and I think they're great. So issue 2 starts with, like we said, like this, like he's literally like solving a crime with these humans, and then like Darkseid is just chilling out and on Earth in this guy's living room
in an
like
Adirondack chair.
Yeah. And then he has to fight this Brola guy, which it's another one of these things that like you see once, and I don't think you ever see this guy again.
No, and when I reread this, I was like, I don't remember Brola at all. I've read this a couple times, and he does not stick with me. And I guess that's because he was never used again. He didn't become part of the Superpowers toy line, but he apparently has this like zapper. He's got a taser. And then he also can turn his hands into bricks, sort of. It's unclear what his powers are, but at some point his hands look like they're bricks with 2 fingers for some reason.
Yeah, he just has brick hands, and like he's a brawler, and that's surprisingly, Superpowers did not pick that idea up.
But they've got to fight, and then the scene on page 9 where it's just the Adirondack chair all by itself and Darkseid is gone underscores how anticlimactic it would have been to walk in and see Darkseid sitting in an Adirondack chair in the middle of a living room. It's such a bizarre introduction. And that's the first time they confront each other in the whole series. It's very strange. But the other thing too about the second issue, again, it starts with a series of splash pages and then big pages with there's a double page splash, there's 3 panels per page, there's another splash page. So again, he's going for the splendor that he just did not use in the other series of the Fourth World. He got right into the storytelling with the other series. With this one, he reserves the spectacle. It's great.
Yeah, and it's often these beautiful like spreads of New Genesis. I think he was really trying to like establish like how the Eden, this technological Eden floating in the sky. That's another thing that's interesting, that the city is floating above this planet of New Genesis. That's interesting. I don't even know what that means, but I thought that was interesting. Like it doesn't even like the technology doesn't interfere with nature or something. I don't know if that's
right.
I don't even know what that means or what that is. Like it's this separate thing. Is interesting.
Yeah, there's a purity to it that I think makes sense, right? It's the technology is above nature, which doesn't mean it's better than it, but it means it's not contaminating the nature below.
Yeah, like they're two separate things, and you can enjoy both separately. It's interesting. So also issue 2, Desaad has this fear machine. So that's the majority of what this issue is like. Desaad is using this fear machine on the human on Earth. And then there's these kind of like, they kind of touch on, there's like a splash page of Mantis on like page 15, where it kind of like touches back to like Forever People. And then the next page is a splash page of the Wild, what's it called? Like the Wild Area from Jimmy Olsen.
Yep.
So there's these connections, like straight up like connections to the other series. I found, so when I tried to read those, the big Omnibus reprints, I found it a little like, especially the Jimmy Olsen issues, pretty like not as easy to get into. and when, you know, there are things that like you said, like it connects dots if you read them all together. But I think I enjoy just reading this on its own, as opposed, maybe if I just cut out the Jimmy Olsen issues or something. I find the Jimmy Olsen stuff is far more dated than the rest, and it's not as interesting. And I think that's because that was the book that DC had more involvement in than any of the other ones.
Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, I would definitely do a series of videos about all the Fourth World comics, but if I were to choose one, it would be New Gods, because it does this. It stands above for me. And then the second one I think would be Mr. Miracle. Mr. Miracle has more of a story, and it also has that family element that even though the New Gods is about ultimately about family and about brothers and fathers and betrayal, Mr. Miracle is about a small nuclear family, and they're trying to figure things out and make their way in the world while these outside forces keep coming in. I like that. Jimmy Olsen, I also have a hard time reading. I end up, when I'm reading the Jimmy Olsen stories, I'm paying attention to his sidekicks, and I'm like, oh, where's Flipper Dipper? Because Flipper Dipper is the most interesting of the sidekicks, because he's wearing scuba gear while he's solving crimes and helping Jimmy Olsen out. And then when I read the Forever People, like, I just lose interest pretty early in the Forever People.
Yeah,
I don't care about those characters at all.
Yeah, a lot of the dialogue, I think it's because he was trying to like tie into this hippie culture. The dialogue in there is pretty impenetrable at times. It really, a lot of people complain about the dialogue in these comics. And New Gods, I don't think there's much to complain about. But yeah, Forever People, it's a little rough at times, where you're like, oh, this is very much a product of its time. But yeah, it's interesting to have this kind of connection to those other ones. I wonder, like you said, like people were just picking this up off of newsstands. Like, unless you were like some huge comic nerd, I mean, good luck finding, you know, the issue 2 of the Forever People where they introduce Mantis, and you're just like, I imagine that, but maybe that was part of the fun. Like, I see it as a potential frustration, but maybe that's just part of the fun of comics back in the day.
It definitely was for me when I was a kid. I read comics for like 5 years before I found out about back issues and comic book stores. But I was reading them quasi seriously for a year or two before I found out about comic shops. So I never was able to get more than a couple issues in a row of anything, and it was pretty cool to try to figure it out. It was also, I was getting into comics in the 80s, so the Marvel Handbook was coming out and the Who's Who started coming out. And so I was able to get other references to fill in the gaps from what I was reading. But in the early 70s, there was nothing like that. And there was nothing like the Fourth World. So you couldn't even try to guess what was going on in an issue that you didn't read. There's no way you would have predicted it. And that Mantis splash page on page 15, that's a gorgeous splash page. And also when I was reading it again, I thought that was the end of the issue. I'm reading it and I wasn't paying attention to how many pages were left. I was flipping through and I get to that and I'm like, oh, this is a good climax to end on. But there's still like 8 more pages of stuff going on. There's a whole like confrontation, and then Darkseid reappears again, and there's a big billboard that's shooting lasers out at Orion. There's a lot of action after that splash page that to me felt like a logical endpoint, but no, Kirby gives us more.
Yeah. So yeah, the issue ends with he shuts down this fear machine, and then they kind of mention that the Black Racer is coming next, and that'll be what we talk about in the next video. There's a lot of stuff that's crazy. I literally just read it, and man, I remember thinking how crazy that was back in the day. But man, it's so good.
It's good. In these first 2 issues, the first issue is just about perfect as far as how it sets things up and the way Kirby's art looks. And the second issue, it gets I think it's a little lumpier, and again, like it throws in these references to other stories, but it's still throwing new ideas out. It's establishing Orion on Earth. Once you get to issues 3 and 4, it swerves. It swerves in a different direction, but it's still fascinating to watch what Kirby's doing. This is a highlight of comics, and this is almost 50 years old. The New Gods is 50 years old next year.
That's crazy.
That is, and it feels like it's still like so current, even though it has some pieces that make it seem dated. It's like you could publish a comic like this right now, and it would still be awe-inspiring, I think, because of what he's pulling off. Amazing.
Yeah, it's crazy that so much of it is a product of its time, where like there's literal, like especially in the next issue, there's literal mentions of the Vietnam War, and a lot of the this, I think a lot of people compare Darkseid to Nixon and stuff like that, but it's still it's a product of its time and timeless at the same time. It's crazy.
Yeah,
that's just Kirby in a nutshell, I guess. But it's quite an accomplishment, not just for comics, but just like storytelling in general. Like the way he could have done anything. Like he could have gone to DC and just he did these like first issue specials. Like I don't know if you're familiar with those, like the Atlas and the Manhunter. Yep. Like he could have just done stuff like that, where he could have just done like some, those are kind of cool issues, but like they don't tell this grand like story where he's like trying to change the format of comics. Like he took this opportunity to do that. So I think it's even like, so the art is amazing, the storytelling, all that stuff, but just the audacity of it all is astounding. Even like you said, 50 years later.
It is. It's so audacious. It's so ambitious. And it's one of those things that at the time, I don't know what it was like to read it off the stands and then to get to that 11th issue and then have it. The 11th issue ends with a cliffhanger of Orion's going to go confront his father, and then there was nothing, and then that was it. I can't imagine, but even now, it's so incredible that he tried. Because you're right, he could have just done a superhero story that was set in space, like maybe he wanted to draw some space stuff. This is not a superhero story. This is a mythological epic using characters that have archetypal qualities but are unique to Kirby. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think people like maybe look at Orion and think like, oh, he's just Silver Surfer meets Thor, but like that's like just like the bare minimum of what's going on here. It's so much more. And like you were saying, I can't imagine what people were thinking when they picked it up. I was doing some research for this. I watched a short documentary about Kirby, and there were a lot of people, a lot of comic book artists talking about how like they looked at his art the kind of the way me and you did, where it's like, that's not for me, it's blocky, it's weird. But it was Walt Simonson was like, I don't know who you've been talking to, but I loved this from the get-go when I was a kid. Like Kirby was everything. He didn't have to grow on me. I thought that was fascinating that, and Simonson kind of picks up some threads later on and does an Orion series, which I'm looking forward to reading that. But anyway, so that wraps up the first 2 issues. So thank you very much for discussing all this. We'll have a lot more to say. That's probably more, we've talking a lot about grandiose format kind of stuff and what was going on in his head, but I guess we'll talk a little bit more about just what's going on in the issues from here on out, because it's not. This is a lot of setup in the first 2 issues.
Yeah, I'm really interested in going deep into the issues, into the storytelling, because Kirby does some things that are worth unpacking. And so let's go deep next time and see what we can find out. It's awesome.
Sounds good.
Thanks for having me. I love doing this. I love talking about Kirby and New Gods. And I love your channel. I always tell you, let's put more content out. Let's go. So here we are.
Yeah, I was doing a lot, and then I kind of hit a roadblock. I bought a Switch, and then I started drawing a new comic too. This was like last year. So I did a comic called Regal, I don't think I recorded any in the entire time I was drawing that comic. So yeah, now I'm trying to get back into it. So thank you for stopping by, and we'll see you soon, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.